All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? So if other people drop in, they can catch up. So thank you for coming, all 5 of us, 6 of us. We're Catherine Unsworth is here as well from ARDC. She'll introduce herself in a little bit, but we're very happy to have you here. We wanted to, before we start the presentation itself, and you've heard this, I'm sure, but I want to make sure that everyone signs in if you can, and to Google Doc, the link of which I'll put in right now to the chat. And then also on this doc is a little bit of an agenda with some sense of timing. Then as we always do, we make sure that you know that by joining the sessions, you agree to the community participation guidelines that are mentioned right here. And if you want to report an issue, that's the place to do that. A little bit about the goals of the session, which are basically to apprise people of what's happening in the kind of teaching and learning universe about collaborative efforts to increase the discoverability of learning resources, and then also to give everyone an opportunity, including me, to hear more about the DRISA platform, the new DRISA platform that ARDC is in the process of putting up. So those are the main objectives or goals for the session. We've got the links to the materials we're going to be presenting on the doc as well. We've got a little Menti, the questions, but that Catherine will be taking away for us, and then a place for also the questions that we can discuss, unless you have others as well, and then a place for meeting notes. So feel free to add any meeting notes. Oh, it's Stace. Stace is here. Hi, Stace. Nice to have you here. So that's the start. So let me get back to slides. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So basically the agenda is, as I mentioned, that, the welcome intros, a little bit of an icebreaker, that I'm going to be talking a lot about collaborative efforts from the RDA, an RDA interest group I was chairing, along with a number of people from around the world who are in this community, and some outputs that we've been able to come up with after 18 months of work. And then Catherine will talk about the DRISA training platform. We'd like to have time for discussions. If we probably won't have enough people to really go on into breakout sessions, which is fine. We can join all in one, and then debrief from those and come up with wrap up. So if you've got questions, both either Catherine, myself, and hopefully Dan or anybody who sees what's on the chat will keep us being able to notice those and answer that, and then we'll go from there. So any quick questions? Anything to start with? Okay. So then, Catherine, do you want to start the Menti? I've got the questions here, or you can, if your slide, you want to share your slide. I think I need to stop so you can.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. So you should be seeing the instructions for the Menti at the moment. So you've got an alternative. If you've got your mobile, you can just scan the QR code from the screen, or you can go to menti.com, or I can, if I can find the chat, pop the link in, or the link is in the document too. So plenty of places to grab it from. So there's the link there that you can go straight into it. So the first question I'll kick off with is, what brings you to this session? So hopefully you're all in the Menti now, and you can start letting us know why you're here.
Hello, Diana, welcome. We just started with a little Menti question. I don't know if you got a chance to see that, the doc.
I'll redo the link in
there you go.
Chat.
Yeah.
Mm.
That'll be fun.
Yes.
Fair data training.
So am I. I'm always interested to see what's happening around the world.
I'll have to hear more about the fair data training session as opportunity to see how what we've got planning can maybe work for you. So.
Okay, I'm assuming that pretty much everybody's had a chance to add their thoughts. So we might move on to the next one, although. So if you're currently, if you do currently share the data skill building and data management training resources that you create, where would we be able to find them and access them?
Right, so we're interested in finding out more about different repositories you might use or learning platforms as well. Yeah.
And that's assuming that they're shareable at this
right.
point too. So, yeah. The ARDC uses Zenodo to share our training materials, and we now have an integration with Dresa as well, so which is pretty neat, which amplifies those training materials even further, which is great. Actually, Nancy, I have a question for you. With the Data Management Training Clearinghouse, that when you upload a training material in the DMTC, does it provide a DOI?
No, we don't. Only if it's already available from the information we can find about the resource itself. Because we don't really. We've talked about this quite a bit over the last few years, but we have not actually done this because we don't really own the content. We don't really have control over the content.
Yes.
So it's less of it'd be a real maintenance nightmare really to keep up with it, and it would not be that persistent really, like in case it changes, not the authoritative copy. But
there has been some discussion.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say there has been some discussion about the appropriateness or the benefits of generating DOIs for the metadata records,
right?
As those have value in themselves, but that hasn't gone anywhere yet either.
Well, we're planning to do it, I think, for the new infrastructure that should be finished by June, and it's certainly important for FAIR. So you'll actually see that's a recommendation in the minimal set too. Anyway, so it'll be interesting to talk about that a little bit more. So Stace, your information didn't get on, but you use the institutional repo, or is it now? Oh, there it is. It just came on. Yeah, good. Okay, great. Okay. Good,
all right. Yeah, so there's various ways that people are sharing their materials at the moment, which is great. I'll move on. Oh, sorry, I just missed someone. What was that? We use Nodo for DOI. When code is involved. Yep. Okay. Very good. All right. The final question is about filtering search results. So if you first search by keyword and get lots of hits, how would you further filter that search? And I guess maybe the better way of putting that is, because it does depend on the search functionality within the platform that you're using. But what would your preference be for filtering searches?
So the more specific search term, meaning something like, well, some of that we were thinking of as examples would be, for instance, date or target audience, or something like that. Is that the kind of thing that whoever is suggested more specific is thinking of? I think you can add more than one response to these, can't you?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Most recent material date. Oh, number of downloads. That's interesting. So how commonly it's used, how often it's used. Yeah.
Yeah, the popularity. Mm-hmm. If it's only used a couple hundred times, then.
Right. Creator. Group terms. Oh, with so kind of Boolean searching, being able to combine. That makes sense too, to make it more precise or broader. I suppose it could be broader too. We use or so. Great. So that's an example. Python R metadata. User ratings, it's the same. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, user ratings is a handy one if it's available within the platform. Okay, I think maybe we've exhausted our answers now. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing. We can capture all this information as well, and I can share that later on. So moving on to.
All right. Sounds good.
Back to you, Nancy.
All right, get my slides going again. Yeah, so let me get into the slideshow. So let's see, those are the questions. So as I said at the beginning, and welcome to the new person who came in, it looks like Thea Marks. Nice to have you here. What I plan to talk about are, as I said, the recent efforts from various teaching and learning communities about what's been going on for the recognized problem of discovery and reuse of existing learning resources or training materials. A lot of places have them. A lot of different domains have them. Domains from different communities have them. There are different kind of environments that could be webinars or short tutorials or all kinds of resources. And how do you find those? Their discovery and then their reuse is more difficult and less widespread than desired. So all of the different groups that are joined this RDA interest group or focus group are coming from that perspective. Some of the affiliated organizations represent different stakeholders, including service providers, instructors and trainers. A lot of people do that, or are service providers. And then there are different national and NGO, non-government organization projects as well. There's a Fair is Fair project out of the EOSC, European Open Science Cloud, that's represented there, as well as a new catalog that they're planning to put up, which is now called EOSC Future. And then various national education agencies from Netherlands, for instance, Germany, and places like that. And then, of course, we're representing ESIP's data management training clearinghouses there as well. So all that group is affiliated with this formal name, RDA Ethrid IG, Research Data Alliance Education and Training on Handling of Research Data Interest Group, which has came up with three different focus groups to kind of address that problem. One on minimal metadata, one on extended documentation that would include metadata, but maybe other forms of documentation as well. And then a group that also has been dealing with the service providers, the people who are aggregating training materials and learning resources, and have a different perspective on the problem. So I've given you a link to all those materials if you want to on the RDA website that include the scoping documents and all that kind of thing if you're interested in that background. And also that's a link to some of the documents that I've got eventually will be available once we get them into a repository. So the goal of that minimal metadata focus group, which is the one that I am chair of, I guess, is to identify a minimal set of metadata descriptors that can be recommended as important for different kinds of users from different learning environments, both formal, so academic kind of MOOCs and other or university sessions like Carl, the one you were talking about with the coffee and code and so on, as well as informal. So the kinds of things that, for instance, the ESIP short course, the very short modules that anybody can kind of dip into and come out of that provide foundational training, but also some domain examples. So any of those are the kinds of things we're thinking about. But they're coming, often people are coming to them from different perspectives. So we wanted to come up with a course set that could be adopted by both content creators and service providers, so it's easier to both find the materials across different platforms, but also share them. So those are the main objectives or goals of that group. And then also the other intention is to help reduce duplication and identify gaps among the resources that exist, so that if we can encourage people to create more, or again, if within our own platforms, if we've got gaps and other people have them, then point to those. So there is a definite interest in trying to collaborate as much as possible. The process itself was, I say, an 18-month effort. We met about every 2 weeks for a very long time, it seemed, but it was a great activity and interesting collaboration. I feel like the people who are on there are all my best friends now. But what we did to do this was to do first a mapping of different metadata schemes across each other, so to speak, and those included some of these key metadata schemes which you may or may not be familiar with: the Learning Resource Metadata Initiative metadata scheme, which is actually what we use in the clearinghouse, or the DMT clearinghouse. There's a learning object metadata that is a profile from the ENVRI catalog. That's an older one. That's one of the older metadata schemes that's been around for a while. At the time we did this, which was based, as I say, about 18 months ago, EOSC had a pilot report that had some terms that they recommended for minimal. So we looked at those. And then bioschemas is another that's what I think you're using, Teresa is using as well. So it's also used a lot for life sciences and so on. So mapped across that. And then finally, schema.org. So the different terms that schema.org provides and are often mapped to some of these other schemas as well. And that's in order to facilitate the search, find this discoverability as well. So we did that mapping. We talked about that, how if they fit from the people who were on the group, knew that different schemas better than knew their own better than others, obviously. But we had good discussions about that mapping itself, and then developed user stories for who would be represented as we were thinking about what should be a minimal set, and compared the set that we are eventually coming up with to each other with those user stories. And they were for a learner, a trainer, which could also be a content provider, a content creator, a service provider, a developer, which mean probably a developer in which is part of a service provider, helping there, and then somebody who might fund these kinds of catalogs. We did do some mapping to FAIR, but and mostly we focused on the F because the focus of the group's efforts was really discoverability. So we've got a little more work to do to move out to the other initials in the FAIR principles. So after what we did, we ended up with our first mapping gave us 84 terms, which, and then the crosswalk exercise, and the user story analysis dropped that down to 80 and then to 12. And part of the feedback came from people at RDA plenary sessions, and a lot of the stakeholders there were often people who, either developers or especially instructors who went, 84, there's no way, so we really had to focus on the minimal part of it. That was really a wise thing to do, I think, from the group's point of view. So we went down to 12, and then we bumped back up to 14 because it appeared as some of the feedback was that this sounds like any kind of a metadata scheme. Why is this about education? So we added some terms that were really key for learning and training. So this is a kind of a visual of the terms we came up with. I've got a better way to show it here in a minute, but so you can actually see what they are in some sense of, so you can actually read the terms are, but they're organized into descriptive information, access information, educational information. So the actual terms under descriptive were title, abstract authors, language, keywords, version date. Access information was a license, if that's available, the URL, to either the landing page or the resource itself, and then identification of the URL resource, the resource URL type, in order to address the need for persistent identifiers, if that's what people wanted to do, or at least tell us, what kind of ID it was. That was an interesting kind of compromise. We'll see how that works. But anyway, then the other educational information is target audience, learning resource type, learning outcomes, and expertise level. And at this point, we've had some discussions about this and probably will again. All the terms are required because there's a lot of discussion about, actually requiring things, even though you allow, say, not applicable or unknown for places where you don't know the answers to those questions, then that's the way to accomplish it. But the idea was that if it's not required, then especially when it comes to sharing resources across systems, you'd never know whether it was just an incomplete record, or the actual activity involved in doing that and the coding and so on could be a lot more difficult. So that's what we decided at this point. We'll see if we stick to that. One of the outputs besides the set was a data dictionary. This is kind of a picture of it. So it's got the name, the definition, the type, meaning whether it's text or date, format, some usage notes, including allowed values, an example, any kind of constraints, and then suggested control vocabularies if there were any that we could identify. And we decided not to require control vocabularies in this because everybody's needs are so different that it's difficult to really do that very well. But then the other thing that doesn't show up on this is some more specific examples, meaning the actual values for some of these terms from a record, for example. And then we created a couple of other examples from different points of view as well, different types of resources. So from the formal point of view and informal and so on. So all of that's available if people are interested in looking at it. So what we're focusing on now is testing this set and facilitating implementation. So the Fair is Fair project out of EOSC is in the process of completing a test where they took 3 to 10 catalog records, essentially, or records from resources from their own, from 10 different systems, or it looks like 9 different systems, and Kat compared them to see how those resources mapped against that minimal set. And it's quite interesting, as you can see, Zenodo, which is a repository that is used by Ferris Fair, Open Air, the new EOS Synergy is a new one, and then I'm not sure, that repository. And then I know, Catherine, you said that you're also using Zenodo, so you've got a comparison later that we can look at, but that Zenodo is what's in blue is what people are using, what is in yellow is what they're not yet using. So it's pretty interesting to see that Zenodo has almost no information about the educational aspect or teaching or learning aspect of a resource that's submitted to the repository. It makes sense because it's a general repository, but one of the efforts of the group, the RDA group, is to sort of, hey, Zenodo, see if they'll add them to what they at least make available through their metadata form. Clearinghouse did pretty well on it. We have some at the educational, not a lot. We don't have learning outcome and expertise level, skill level at this point. We'd like to add that with our new a metadata scheme. Got that planned. The EOS pillar is one that's being built right now, and as you can see, it really kinds of changes. TESS is I think it's mostly bio, isn't it, Catherine? TESS is mostly biological educational resources.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then Shock is these are other catalogs that were represented by people on the group and so on. So, a lot of them are used. There's definitely work to go there. And part of what they're going to be doing with this testing and implementation work is they've identified specific terms that might be an issue that we may want to consider, such as authors. There's not always an author. There's sometimes more than one. Sometimes, there's contributions that would not necessarily include authorship, but people would like to report it. Also, other comments that people have made, it's about if you wanted to suggest and encourage citations of these things, which we would, then there might be other information that we need as well. But anyway, you can see what people have talked about so far. The other thing that we're doing that's associated with the testing and implementation is developing an application profile, which is for the metadata itself, using a template that Dublin Core has just created. And a metadata application profile is basically a list of properties that are considered valid for a scheme, metadata scheme, and the purpose is to help determine and kind of encourage the correct usage of the scheme. So it does that by defining the terms themselves, and as the term name and the value or property and the value pair that's used to describe the resources, any constraints, and then the rules that govern them. So we thought that was important for the RDA minimal set because we've got so many different stakeholders, instructors and trainers and content creators and so on, as we talked about before. A lot of the catalogs are already using different schemas. And so, if there's a mechanism for allowing them to express their own interpretation of that main profile, then it's easier to, again, do the exchange. So that's something that we're in the process of doing. And then it would also help facilitate the different platforms really using this set to exchange the metadata. So the intention for it was really to encourage and support the sharing and reuse of existing learning resources, also for metadata creation by resource creators, make sure that they can easily see what they really would need to describe, and then the easier metadata exchange. So the thing about the DC profile, the tabular application profile, is that it allows us to reuse what we already have created for the data dictionary. There's a little bit more information that we will need to add to it, but it seems like a fairly straightforward way to do this. And a lot of people have found this helpful because if it's in this form, it can also be changed to different, exported as different representations as well, JSON or XML or whatever you want to do. So I've got a link here, I hope it's active, to the first draft of it. We've got a lot more work to do there. And if you are interested in the profile, in that tab profile itself, the primer, there's the link to the primer there as well. So the other outputs then, I'm coming to the close, I really am. The other thing we came up with was a group, core characteristics of essentially learning resource service providers in order to facilitate the sustainability of those organizations. It was pretty clear as we started talking in the various groups that one of the problems with these kinds of catalogs and so on is that they're funded for a time. And then, you know, I mean, along with a lot of different organizations, how do you keep sustaining it when you put that kind of investment in it, especially if it's a project-based kind of thing, or you've gotten, you know, short-term funding. So that's obviously something that's dear to our hearts too, for the data management training clearinghouse, because you know, that's always a question of funding, but the sustainability is important in order to not only use the investment of time and effort, but to continue to share and so on. So this little introduction here is just essentially gives you the sense of what kinds of characteristics are talked about. Again, I've given you the link to it if you want. That is in the process of being vetted as well, and we are looking at it as well for the clearinghouse to see what some parts will be more applicable than others depending on the type of resource or type of service you provide. And then finally, a number of organizations, a number of catalogs are planning to adopt the minimal set, and then the next effort is to hand off that minimal set to another RDA group, which is to look at extended documentation. So there were a lot of discussion about, you know, gosh, we need publisher, gosh, we need other kinds of contributions, gosh, we need, you know, this and that. And so all of those are represented still in that mapping that we had before. So the group that God knows how long that'll take, but we'll see what happens with that in terms of extending this set. So I think that's all I had here. Any questions right now for anybody, from anyone, about anything I've covered?
Carl, did you want to pose your question?
No.
Looks like Stace has her hand up.
Oh, Stace. There's a comment also in the chat too.
Okay. Stace, you want to ask your question first?
Okay, I'll ask a question first. Basically, as a instructor who's developing new materials and adopting others' materials as well, like I was listening to your minimal set and I was thinking about it, and I really like it's the couple of additions that you'd make to a Dublin Core metadata record. Those couple of additions are actually what we put at the top of a syllabus. You know what I mean? Like, like you want to know what are the learning outcomes, who's the target audience, things like that. And so I was thinking about it like in terms of the person creating the content, those very few additional terms are some things that we probably think about anyways. So it's not that much effort to include those when we upload our training materials. If you give me more, I will not fill them out though. You know what I mean? Like, but those really are, I think they really were a nice core set of additional bits of information to include. That's great.
That's great to hear, because it even in a lot of people don't put that kind of information in on the metadata, you know, for the landing page and so on. So we really wanted to encourage people to do that, because it does make a difference, I think, for people looking for resources, especially if they're kind of randomly searching. You know, you really want to know what an outcome might be. So that's great to hear. Thank you. Okay, so is that your question? Is that your question then? That's in the chat. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and I think I had the question about the original larger list of metadata terms, and you highlighted that you ended up sort of distilling down. It sounded like to those that were probably most aligned with the F in FAIR. I'm wondering if that original set may have some potential for future mining and classification for the other characteristics of FAIR, thinking about being able to extend beyond the minimal set and being able to leverage the work that the group has already done in being able to fill out the rest of FAIR, and possibly eventually be able to develop some additional rubrics or scoring models for metadata beyond the appropriately largely mandatory minimum.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. We started doing that to some extent as the original mapping. I did the original mapping, and so I had also included, in my thoughts about what could be useful for those other resources, but there just wasn't enough time and kind of common understanding of FAIR to do that in that group, in the minimal set group. And we were trying to get the minimal set. So that's why we decided, well, since it's mostly focused on discoverability, we'll just focus on FAIR. And it's also an evolving, it's a moving target to some extent. One of the things we did do before coming up with the set, I didn't mention it except on the slide, that we did a comparison of what others had come up with as required for minimal or required for FAIR. So we looked at that, but not in enough detail to really get into the AI and R aspects of it. So that's definitely we want to do in that other group. And Catherine, I think you've got a mapping too. One of the things we will show when we get down to the discussion part too is a mapping that Catherine and her group did to map against what other people are doing. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if you did it with respect to FAIR or not, but we can see that.
And I guess the other question I might have related to starting with the minimum, but potentially eventually expanding, have you discussed a particular encoding model for machine readability for those materials to streamline, a future world in which somebody could register their learning resource, and if they have machine readable metadata associated with that resource, for example, the DMTC could take their provided URL and harvest the metadata as a part of the ingest pipeline for then the curation and review process.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's one of the reasons we chose the DC TAP, because partly because the DC at this point is DCMI, the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, is more focused on RDF rather than something like JSON or JSON LD. But the ways to export or manipulate, show that representation there are tools that are making that a lot easier to do. The reason they chose, that DC group chose the tabular application is because, as part of their template at first, is because so many metadata schemes express them as in that form, in that spreadsheet form. Metadata people love spreadsheets. So they're kind of going along with what would get the mapping, the application profile business going, so to speak, and then kind of relying on the tools. And part of what they want to do as this group there's a Google group that's working on it, is to also help with tools that would do that more automatic representation in other formats. So it's definitely people, and the EOSC people, for instance, are definitely looking at that question as well. So for their own, they'd have an API that would maybe do some of that translation and so on too, if they're with the metadata, the minimal set, and are planning to look closely at this profile. So yeah, definitely, that's what people are interested in doing. So yeah,
great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, the other comment about the IOC and UNESCO specification. Yeah, they're definitely, if there are opportunities, if you think this might be useful, then be in touch with me or anybody on the group, and we're looking for people to adopt, and we can work with you on it a little bit. So thank you for that. Okay, I guess that I will stop sharing then, and I think there aren't any other questions right now. Catherine, I think you're next on the agenda. Do you want to take it away?
I'll reshare my screen and hopefully I have ticked the box. I just realised too that I actually didn't introduce myself earlier. Yeah. So I got a little bit carried away. So I'm Catherine Unsworth and I work at the Australian Research Data Commons. I lead the skilled workforce development team there. And so obviously training and training materials is of high importance to us. And what I've actually pre-recorded my talk because I have been unwell a little bit in the last little while, so I'm not convinced that I won't cough and splutter through a presentation. So I thought I'd pre-record it. But what I am mostly going to talk about is an initiative, a national initiative in Australia called Digital Research Skills Australasia, and it's a training portal for data and digital research skills training events and activities and materials. So before I do that though, because there was something else that I forgot to do, was an acknowledgement of country, which is something that as an Australian, I feel I should do. So before I kick off, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I come to you from today. And these are the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I also pay my respects to their elders past and present and the elders from other communities who may be here today as well. So with that, I will play this and hopefully you can hear it properly. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a project I've been involved in right from its very beginnings. It's a project that actually makes my heart sing. So if you catch a hint of evangelism, please forgive me. I'll be talking about the Australian journey in deploying a national training infrastructure as part of a nationally coordinated skills agenda. But just a little bit about the initiative that employs me. The Australian Research Data Commons was created to bring about transformational change. This change was needed largely because of increasing data volumes, the growing complexity of data, the digital impact on research practice, and the ever-dwindling pool of research funding. Sector-wide, publicly funded research needed to be effective and efficient for researchers to allow them more time to do great research and explore innovative research methods. For this to happen, the generation and collection and the analysis and use of data and other research assets needed coherent and coordinated management. To enable that coherence, the Australian Research Data Commons brings together people, skills, data and related sources or resources such as storage, compute, software and models to enable researchers to conduct world-class data-intensive research. So as a result, we're starting to see a skills imperative emerge. Over the last few years, there has been increasing recognition that data and digital research skills training is now and should be a focal point for research communities. The dots are being connected. Excellence in research can only be attained by having a highly skilled research workforce. There's been extensive funding across the globe for research infrastructure. But as the OECD 2020 Building Digital Workforce Capacity and Skills for Data-Intensive Science policy paper describes, a digitally skilled workforce is required to complement investments in data-intensive scientific infrastructure. There's recognition in this statement that the gear and kit isn't enough. In addition to the infrastructure, there needs to be skilled people who can improve design, further develop, manage, maintain, and use this infrastructure. Another more recent indicator on the shifting of focus from infrastructure to people, and very much from my own backyard, is the 2021 Australian National Research Infrastructure Roadmap Exposure Draft, and I'll quote from that draft. Rapid advances in computing techniques and analysis and management of large and complex data sets have resulted in researchers no longer having sufficient expertise in computational, data management and analysis techniques. There should be consideration of how national system-wide approaches to training and services could benefit researchers. This, of course, is music to the ARDC's ears. The Skilled Workforce Development Team, which I lead, we have an implementation plan for 2021 to 2023, and this plan involves cracking some of the big chestnuts that underpin the National Skills Agenda, a training portal being one of those chestnuts. So best to be clear, the ARDC is not a training organisation. We could never scale to provide sector-wide digital research skills training. Instead, our skills training focuses on skilling up the sector on services that we directly provide. For example, PID services such as data site DOIs, IGSNs, and our homegrown RAIDs. We have Research Vocabularies Australia, which is a vocabulary service. We also have Data Discovery Service, the Research Data Australia Registry, and we also provide cloud computing services offered by Nectar Cloud. So we do training to help people use the infrastructure that we provide and also the services that we provide. We do, however, have a role to play in bringing research and training communities together to ensure that the research sector as a whole is highly skilled, not just training for researchers either, but contributors to research and research support professionals, as well as infrastructure designers, developers, managers, and maintainers. Our approach is to tackle this as holistically as we can. It's ambitious, and we're not expecting to do this on our own. Instead, we are leveraging our solid relationships with partners across the sector to help coordinate the delivery of skills training through existing skills communities, such as the Carpentries and ResBaz communities. We're also working with others to jointly develop fair training materials that will have a sector-wide impact. We're currently in the process of recruiting a learning/instructional designer to further this work. We have a basic skills landscape that is ready to take to the next level, and we have potential interest from some folk in Canada in partnering with us on that work. And of course, the National Training Infrastructure Initiative, Digital Research Skills Australasia Training Portal, or otherwise known as DRESA, which is really why I'm here and what I want to focus on. So how did DRESA come to be? Training nationally has been on a change journey for many years, but I'll start from the recent past, 2019, when trainers came from around Australia shared pain points about their backlog of training requests, lack of time to develop what researchers needed, and lack of awareness of who's doing what. Many discussions were started and ideas shared, and the enriched community of practice was set up on Slack to continue those discussions. In 2020, we were still in our separate worlds doing our own things, but we got a little more specific. 2020 was a year of chaos globally, but it was also a year of focus and tangibles within the Australian trainers community. At the 2020 Australian Research Data Commons, or ARDC, Australian e-Research and Data Skills Summit, the need for a national training registry and calendar emerged as a priority, from which sprung the 14-member working group who eventually built DRESA. One of the initial tasks of the working group was to do a scan of existing training portals. As it happened, one of our group had connections through her previous work at EMBL EBI. Dr. Melissa Burke from the Australian Biocommons pointed us to Elixir's test training portal as a potential candidate and connected the group with the test developer Chris Childs. There was now a clear pathway via the Australian Biocommons connection. Talks proved fruitful, but spinning up our own instance of test needed an injection of software development skills in order to transition the existing test architecture and code base into a portal that met our specific needs. The Pawsey Supercomputing Centre kicked in with the initial investment to get the development show on the road. This gave the group the opportunity to snaffle the services of a highly qualified software engineer, Nick May. The ARDC then significantly topped up the investment to further develop DRESA. We've taken the test model further by adding trainer profiles into the registry and some other neat functionality like cloning events and materials. We've made all of the new changes available to the test folk, and they are free to adopt or not. In 2021, as a community, we understood the need. We had decided on a common set of outcomes to deliver, and using and building on existing infrastructure and standards, we're able to come together to make DRESA happen. Without pause, I would say this is the best collaborative project of my career so far. We have a mix of partners, not just universities, but training service providers, national infrastructures, national research organisations, and so on. Obviously, we are hoping to grow this group and also bring in partners from New Zealand. But what is DRESA? DRESA is a national level portal for discovering training events, materials, training providers and trainers. Training materials and activities that relate closely to data and digital research skills needs are the ones that we will capture in DRESA. And for the foreseeable future, the focus will be on Australian and New Zealand developed content. However, this would not exclude linking in with other international registries, repositories and training provider sites, such as the Carpentries, the Data Management Training Clearinghouse and others. And we're about to kick off some of those discussions shortly. So who are the likely users of DRESA? DRESA is for researchers, research support staff, or anyone seeking digital research skills training. DRESA is a way for training providers and trainers to amplify their training so that as a training community we can understand who is doing what training, when and where across the sector. DRESA provides a central place for training providers and trainers to share their training events and materials, contribute to a growing catalogue, and help to make training materials fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. Designing, developing and delivering training requires significant resourcing, but by making training events and materials more visible and more accessible, and by shining a light on trainers and what training they're doing, we can enable collaborative partnerships to emerge, we can cut down on duplication, and we can identify the gaps to focus future training development. There's still so much to be done. Some of the work that the project team will tackle from January through to late March 2022 on the development side of things are refining existing automated ingest processes and working with training providers on new ways to automate ingest that better suits them. We want to incorporate the Australian and New Zealand standard research classification field of research codes via an integration with the Research Vocabularies Australia, that the service that the Australian Research Data Commons provides. We also want to be able to provide alternative login methods to those currently available. Login is only available to people in organisations who have an Australian Access Federation login or the New Zealand equivalent to a Kiri. So we do need to find, have other ways for people to log in where they don't have that existing capability. And we also want to build in an e-learning registry as well, which TESS currently does have, so it possibly won't be too difficult to spin up as part of DRESA. And we've also always got the bug fixes that need to be rectified. It's an ongoing thing. Aside from the development work, we have the issue of sustainability. We're taking a 5-step approach to ensure the sustainability of DRESA. Step 1 was finding the right technical architecture, TESS. There are a number of other groups using and looking to use the TESS architecture for their own training portals. This means there is a growing community to support further development of the TESS architecture. And so sharing the load of future development means we can also build in greater sustainability. Step 2 is to build critical mass of content. We need a communications plan to drive phased socialisation of the training portal. We plan to have a primary focus on socialising DRESA with training providers initially and trainers so that we can set up and test ingest processes, align and adjust metadata capture and stress test user functionality, and obviously to build the content. Once there is a solid foundation of content and growing content, we can then focus on potential users of the training. To be sustainable, we need to make DRISA both easy to use and useful so that it becomes the go-to portal for data and digital research training in Australia. Step 3 is to link in with international training registries, repositories and websites where that makes sense in an Australian and New Zealand context. That is where that training is being offered in Australia. The Carpentries is an example of that. For interoperability and automated ingestion to work between these registries and repositories, there needs to be common terminology or terminology that can be easily cross-walked. We're talking about FAIR here, so metadata standards are key. Step 4 is to identify a suitable governance and funding model that works for stakeholders. Part of this work will require the drafting of a curation/collection plan with explicit roles and responsibilities. We need to identify who will own and manage DRISA and work out the most appropriate funding model. And then step 5 is to stop and assess, measure and evaluate the impact of DRISA, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what can we improve. And then we'll just start that cycle through again. So that's the DRISA story in a nutshell. I mentioned the importance of metadata and how critical it is, and I'm going to talk about it. So I thought I'd just stop it there, Nancy, because we're not going to go into breakout rooms, and that the remainder of it was talking about going into breakout rooms and the discussion from there. But because we're such a small group, we can just have a look at the questions that we've got and have an open discussion. So yeah, if there are any questions, I notice a comment there from Pierre. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. There probably isn't, there won't be a focus, a domain focus for DRISA, so it will cover off on all various domains for training materials. So yeah, we definitely welcome any domain content related to data and digital research skills training. But yeah, I must follow up and have a look at the IOC UNESCO systems stuff as well. So that's interesting. Thank you for that.
It's quite straightforward. I mean, in the sense that the system is actually built up by all the nodes, right? So it's not like a system that it's just a question of sharing the metadata on your own holdings to make it discoverable across all of the other participants. And it's not to say that if any of DRISA's content has anything to do with marine data, then it's an easy in. So, you know, looking at the system as you described it, I think it would be fairly trivial. And that sharing system also follows a lot of ESIP guidelines for sharing via schema.org. It speaks to Carl's point about actually federating stuff out and building search interfaces to discover it. As the link shows, it's already working, and we'll be able to, by the middle of this year, have a more attractive web interface for it. And we've had nodes of varied capacity, from high capacity nations to developing nations, being able to plug into this. So let us know if you're interested. We then have,
yeah, definitely. Thanks very much for that. That is really interesting. I will follow up with you.
It looks like Sahara had found something too. Sahara, do you want to mention that? What you found?
Yeah, so I was exploring the DRISA website, and I found a module that provides some guidelines on connecting to high performance computing. And I was wondering if there is a HPC platform or HPC infrastructure that is being provided to trainers or trainees on DRISA, or do you have any collaborators on that on board? Because supercomputing is one thing trainers and trainees are always looking forward to, and if it's cloud-based, then it's like a bonus point for them. So is there anything on board right now?
So we have two of our partners are in the HPC area, so it's the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre, and also NCI, so the National Computational Infrastructure. And so they have representation via DRISA, so that they have a whole range of training that they offer to their HPC communities, and that is hopefully going to be amplified through DRISA as well. So DRISA is just a registry, so we don't actually hold the training materials themselves. We point out to where those training materials and training events are being held. So it is really just a registry, and so that, you know, you've got this one place, this kind of federated search that you can do across all the various domains and skills areas.
Okay.
Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if it did or not.
It does. It definitely does, because I found some other organization mentioned over there. Probably the training material was provided by them, QCIF. So definitely, now I am able to connect the dots of how this works. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks.
Any other questions for Catherine? Teresa? Yeah, I haven't looked at it that closely either. It'll be fun to see what's in there.
Well, it'll be nice for us to work with our training providers and trainers and get that content built up in there. You know, that is our very first step at the beginning of this year to really push hard in that area, because it's not going to be useful or sustainable if it doesn't have content.
Right, right.
You know, obviously.
Yes, and we discovered that too with the clearinghouse, that, you know, we had to, it's a balance of, you know, what do you focus on first, but you don't want to let people know about the content until there's actually content. So, you know, you have to chicken before the egg, or however that works.
Yeah. Well, we also, I have in my mind too, because we have as I mentioned, a skills landscape, you know, which is a kind of taxonomy of skills in data and digital research. And so what I'm hoping to do is have an interactive version of that, a web version of that, where people can go in and actually click on skill sets and drill down to the skills that they're very interested in, and having on that page a lookup. So you can search DRESA for training materials and training events related to that skill. So I've spoken to Nick about that, and he says that is quite doable. So if we can sort of start linking our systems in together, we can actually start creating a user pathway for people to actually start thinking about how they might develop their skills, and give them that pathway into where the training actually sits, and you know, training materials to help them do that. So yeah, lots of things on the agenda. Yeah, just got to get around to doing them.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, when we were the work with the RDA group, there was definitely some discussion about the fact that they're calling learning pathways are starting to be created from different tests. Was definitely one that was starting to do that. So that's that's also really interesting to think about it from the point of view of kind of a skills and competencies framework as well. We've talked about that some with the clearinghouse, that, you know, the area of data stewardship or data curation is still kind of new, and the distinction between that and data science is also confusing for people. It's easier to see what those different categories cover if you've got that kind of framework that discusses those, and that's something that the Fair is Fair group is working with as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves as more and more resources are starting to be available, and people are understanding what tasks are necessary for that kind of support of research and so on. So yeah, interesting to see. Okay, well, so no other questions. The other thing we just thought we'd do, we've got, I guess, about 20 minutes or so left to talk about issues more broadly, or we came up with a couple of questions to start with, but I don't know if anyone, we can also leave it open a little bit if you have anything that you're interested in talking about in this kind of environment related to either metadata or, you know, kind of the concept of both making resources both discoverable and reusable in different environments. If there are any issues that anybody wants to talk about, any questions to ask, and we can discuss, that'd be fine, or we can go back to our questions as well.
One question I have relates to sort of the maintainability of the entries, the content of the registry, as you know, maybe learning materials are updated, maybe they're replaced with new versions that may be elsewhere. They could be refreshed. They could be deprecated by their authors. It seems that that's another, I think, probably key component as we're talking about the metadata, because that comes back to hopefully having a machine readable standard that is associated with the landing pages for those learning resources. So that, and this is something that Matt Jones and I were talking about a few weeks ago in the context of some of the early discussions they've been having around learning resources and maintaining knowledge of those resources, and the importance, or I should say probably the incredible value of being able to harvest and repeatedly harvest metadata for learning resources, so that as they evolve in the hands of their creators, their corresponding metadata and the registries can be updated to reflect their current state. As you know, we've talked about and have experienced, especially you, the labor intensive process of both creating the metadata, and even when created, the likely overwhelming prospect of trying to refresh those metadata based on sort of a manual process that is currently embedded in certainly the processes we have in the DMTC. So I think that's another thing to be thinking about in terms of maintenance and how harvestability of the metadata can both streamline entry but also maintenance.
That's interesting. So I'm interested in the emphasis on the landing page template, or it sounds like you were talking about a standardization of the way learning resources might show up on their own landing page. Did you mean in the registry or in the catalog itself, or in?
I'm thinking about the learning resources in the wild. So having a convention that hopefully could receive some degree of widespread adoption, where, and while the landing pages don't necessarily need to be themselves standardized in their look and feel, because that, you know, everyone has their own branding that they're wanting to maintain, but having a standard way within that landing page to point to or provide the structured metadata about the related learning resource that can be harvested once the link to that landing page has essentially been registered with one of our registries.
And so that would be, for instance, could be based on the minimal set, yes. But you're also talking about the sequencing, the way those terms are sequenced.
It could be the way they're sequenced. And this is back to my original question about machine readable representation, or a standard model, not just for the metadata content, but for its actual structure, so that it can be, you know, embedded and easily read by a harvester, so that it can check to see if there are any changes to the metadata in subsequent, you know, through subsequent harvests.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Catherine, are you, in terms of what Teresa is doing, is there, how does that sound to you as a mechanism?
Yeah, it's actually a step that we need to put in place. So we don't have our metadata currently isn't machine readable, and and Nick has flagged that as something that we need to really focus on. And so that's why I was interested in the application profile that you're looking at using, because I think we probably will need to look at a similar sort of thing. And I guess it comes down to with the little bit of mapping that I did, and I don't know if I can share that. That's in the link is in this.
Yeah, do you want me to
Yeah, if you could share it, if you can easily get to it.
Okay. Am I still sharing? I guess I am. No, yeah, I'm sharing.
I stopped. Yeah, you can share.
I'm not sharing. I can share. There, how's that? Can you see it?
Yeah, that's it. So it's just interesting. So the bioschemas, they have kind of just the 3 required fields there, but they do have some other fields that are required that are obviously system related metadata. So not what, you know, the trainer or training provider would put in place, but it would, you know, sort of be part of the underlying system. With ours, we have 7. So Nancy and I have been discussing this in terms of what we found was, given the current situation in terms of what people are including as metadata elements in their on their, you know, sort of pages that they're describing their training materials or they're describing their training events, they're using quite minimal metadata at the moment. And so if in DRESA we decided that we had this kind of long list of required fields, very quickly it would fall over because they, you know, our providers wouldn't be able to fill in those fields. And we talked about having some default content that we could put in those empty fields if that occurred. And so we're still in that discussion phase around that. But a part of our documentation that we give to and will give to our training providers, it includes that minimum metadata set that we require. And we will work with people to make that cultural change around including more and more metadata. So when we are having discussions with people, we will sort of say, you know, to them, okay, these metadata fields are recommended, not required, but we'd really like you to start thinking about putting some effort into including those so that we do have richer metadata records in DRESA. And it gives people, you know, the opportunity to look at something immediately and not necessarily have to link out, because they can immediately tell, well, this training material is not useful for me, or this training material is not current, you know, it's no longer an active, it's been archived, so, you know, therefore, you know, I don't need to look at this one, I'll skip over. But yeah, so one thing I did want to ask you about in terms of the RDA minimum set, and I've called it minimum, you're referring to it as minimal, was the cost. So first, my question is this just related to training materials and resources, or is this related to metadata for training events as well?
The group, the RDA group, kept events out of scope.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
Because we have quite different metadata for our training events to our training materials. So I just wasn't quite sure about that. But you have cost as a metadata field here. And I just wonder what the rationale behind that was for training materials. So some training materials cost, do they?
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of discussion about that. And actually in that test bed that I was telling everyone about, one that came up as an issue as well, because when the people doing the testing compared records across different catalogs, they found that access constraints was more commonly included or needed to be included more than cost itself. Now, part of that is, I think, because most of the catalogs they were looking at, or registries they're looking at, only include resources that are free. You know, they're interested in open resources. So that's so they were saying, so if that's the kind of the mission and the scope of the catalog, then having that, you know, having to have always say free, or, you know, no cost, no for every record is kind of burdensome and unnecessary. So, but I think that part of the rationale for including it was the fact that that's not always the case. You know, I mean, there definitely are resources that cost, especially if the scope of your registry is to include, you know, resources that you may need to pay for as part of a, you know, getting a certificate, a professional certificate, or if, you know, if you're getting, you know, something from an industry and a certain tool and so on, and they've got, you know, you're learning how to be a master Excel person. Microsoft has all of these kinds of courses you can take, but, you know, it'd be important to know that that's a fee, not a course or some resource for a fee rather than free. So I'm not sure where that's going to end up. I think it makes sense to include, and part of the reason also is, because we are mapping a lot of this to schema.org, that's something that schema.org has as, you know, a Boolean yes or no. It's a real simple thing to add. But it may be that what we want to do is allow also for access constraints, so that you can express the fact that, you know, you can only get into this if you're, you know, a member of the class, or you know, whatever it might be, or it's associated with an event. And if you're not paid for part of the event, then you can't get it. You can only get it till, you know, 2 months later, the kind of thing that AGU does, for instance, for some of their kinds of things. But that, the question is whether that's minimal or not, or whether it should be part of extended, because there was always so much pressure to keep the numbers down, because, you know, because of that tendency of creators to put in minimal information in the metadata itself. Now, you know, Stace's comment about, well, when we create resources as content creators, we always put in what the learning outcomes are and that kind of thing. So it'd be easy just to cut and paste that and put into a record, I think is what she's essentially saying. So that's true, but you know, not everyone does that either, especially in kind of an informal environment. So it's a good question, and I think part of it will take some more testing just to see what's important to keep.
And one of the things I'm wondering about, because you highlighted the schema.org as sort of a reference schema at the beginning. But I'm wondering what degree of overlap in the ultimate schema that was for the minimal metadata that was identified, how that lines up. I think about schema.org in particular as in the context of addressing some of this return on investment, the incentive for content creators to develop more robust metadata, because with the potential for broader enhanced discovery through the search engines, through the use of schema.org, you know, this is the same, you know, one of the same motivations around the science on schema.org activities, where there are collateral benefits to adopting schema.org, because it enables certainly harvesting and machine readability for specialized clearinghouses like we're talking about here, but it also allows for harvesting and indexing and discovery through the large search engines, which remain, I think, the primary discovery path to learning resources that folks are using. And so that's the incentive for content creators to potentially create more robust metadata that can be used across platforms and even by systems outside of the research data training ecosystem we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think you mentioned this earlier, Carl, when you were talking about the potential for the application profiles. I mean, one of the things that I think it will inevitably come out of that, if nobody else does, I'm going to do it, mapping that you know, sort of tabular form to schema.org, because there's a place where you have a property ID, and the IDs are associated with namespaces. And the mapping is already available to have the schema.org namespace with a term, because both bioschemas and LRMI, the one that the clearinghouse uses, already use the schema.org namespace for many of their terms. So it would be, not trivial, and it would take, you can always interpret and misinterpret what goes on with schema.org, but in terms of your own, another schema. But there's a lot of interest in doing that. So I think that's an inevitable step of, at least for the minimal set. Now, what it'll do, for a broader kind of documentation is unclear. But if the point is really to help people find these things and give, as you say, the creators motivation to make their resources available, let themselves be known as experts in certain areas, getting credit for what they're doing and so on, that's a step that's part of the cycle and the process, I think. So a lot of hope there. We'll see what happens, but yeah. And I think also, as we start trying to make that mapping and shared exchange of metadata available in different environments, that's going to be one of the ways it's done with JSON or JSON LD as well. So fingers crossed. Yeah, good question. Anything else that we can go back to that, the questions we had? Let me go back there.
We're actually coming up to pretty much time. It's 9:25 by me. So,
okay.
But I was just going to make one mention. It's interesting, and it's a very Australian thing, because we are an English-speaking country. We haven't put language as one of our metadata fields in DRESA, whereas the RDA obviously has that as a minimum. And so I think we really need to think about that and have that included, because we would like to actually expand out to Asia as well. We've had some interest from Asia, so that would be interesting to accommodate some of the Asian languages. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and I think that we, again, when part of the feedback that we got from this RDA group, the RDA group itself and RDA in general, at this point is, at least in this area, is fairly Eurocentric, North American centric, and Australian. And so fewer people show up from, South American countries, Asia, Middle East. There just aren't enough, there aren't people representing. But the point that came out very strongly when there were people from South America, at least, was language. And it's not just language itself, but the fact that the context is really important under which you're creating something. So that if somebody wants to adapt a resource to their own different geographic environment, and even, there are regional differences, there are contextual differences even within, the Spanish language, for instance, in South America. So then that's part of the discussion that we want to have with that extended documentation, because, especially for reuse, you really have to give people enough to be able to successfully adapt something that's already there, or if they create something, do the reverse, make that information available so somebody else could reuse it in a different language environment. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. So, okay, well, let's see, I guess we need to get back to, if you have any other comments or questions or anything you want to put into the chat, we appreciate hearing that. We need to come up with a couple of takeaways for a group. We can take those from the notes, but anybody have any thoughts that you want to pop in as a takeaway for the efforts that are related to discovery and reusability of learning resources? Happy to put them in the chat. We can, or put them in the notes, or just speak them.
I think the interoperability benefits of shared standards for representing and exchanging metadata for learning resources is a huge plus.
Yeah, definitely. And and doing that, learning by doing, trying to adopt, trying to implement across different systems is really the practical way to do that. So.
Yeah, because I think that's certainly been the lesson we've learned from the DMTC in terms of, after users gain experience with the platform, they develop much stronger opinions that they're willing to share about areas where the documentation model can be enhanced or changed.
Yeah.
There's something also to be said about starting with something simple, like a tabular format, because that's getting the content right. People agree on the content and saying, yes, this is what we must cover. Because in different implementations of digital exchange, schema.org, JSON-LD, DCAT, you're going to not be able to express all of it as well. They'll have strengths and weaknesses. So sort of starting there, getting the actual, what is the information we wish to exchange down, and then casting that out in various formats and making, writing the specifications for that can help it scale across different systems without being locked into anyone.
Yep. Good. Okay, that's 3. We're good. Thank you. Those are great. All helpful. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Catherine for getting up early.
Oh no, thanks for the invite, Nancy. It was great.
Yeah.
Really good to be a part of this.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone for attending and participating and thinking this through with us. So, and Susan as well. Thanks for
a lot of fun.
And Sahara. Yeah. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Talk to you later.
Have a great
Thanks.
evening or day.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night from Europe.